Okay, so is Jesus descended from apes? That's the question today. And in order to help us to actually start answering this, there's a few predicates that we need to assume when you're sitting in the audience today. And one is, this idea of descent. It's probably it's a credible scientific theory. Okay, this idea of evolution. So you're sitting here with probably know a little bit about evolution, highly probable. From this question, we can also see the word Jesus, and we're assuming that one of the predicates is that Jesus existed, or someone called Jesus existed, that he was human, okay, hence the ape part. And the reason why we're sitting here today is probably, hopefully, because this Jesus was important enough that this question is controversial or important enough for you to want to listen to as well. Okay, so that's just some predicates to start us off with, and some perspectives, because we like inspiration. There's a spectrum of perspectives, and like Andrew was saying, this may not reflect exactly what he used, not vote of confidence, but may not reflect exactly what EU's perspective is, but from young Earth creationism all the way down to atheistic evolution and everything in between. So we won't be hitting every single one of these, but we'll be kind of spending our time on either side of this and talking a little bit in the middle. And so the typical division here is between young Earth and old Earth, and what we mean by that is young Earth creationism kind of says that the Earth that we live on is about 6,000 years old, and old Earth means it's about 3.5 or 4.5 billion years, plus or minus a few. So that's kind of the perspectives. But between the perspectives, I think what's underlying these perspectives is actually a different kind of question. It's not, are you a young Earth creationist, are you a theistic evolutionist? I think the question is between Genesis and science and evolution. Okay, so are these compatible? And normally we can think, these are kind of versing each other, and therefore they're just totally incompatible, or they're just unequal and can never meet in the middle. Okay, so what I want to do in the next few minutes is kind of go through Genesis. Okay, we'll spend a bit of time in Genesis, and then we'll spend a bit of time in evolution. We'll give roughly the same amount of attention and time and critique to both. And then we'll kind of wrap up at the end and talk about those perspectives. Okay, so let's kick off with Genesis. I forgot to organise the person to read this for us. Andrew, you want to read for us? Last minute, Andrew, thank you.
So this is from Genesis, chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse, and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good.
Okay, so far what we've seen is we've seen a few kind of key points that God was there from the start. Okay, that's what Genesis and the Bible tells us. Another key point is that stuff just seems to happen at his command. So he says something and stuff happens. And also there's this kind of progression here from not disorder but unorder, all the way through to order, okay, in this part of Genesis. So let's keep reading.
And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day.
So again, what we're seeing here is we're seeing God doing things, he's creating things, and we see here different kinds of things being created.
And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, each according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good.
Okay. So again, some interesting repetition here. There's more kinds and even more kinds of things being created in the world.
Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so.
Okay, so we see in this particular passage here, humans created in God's image, in inverted commas. We can look into what that means. Humans are kind of different to the other kinds that exist, and also that we see the idea that the creation is there for the humans, and we're different in that sense.
And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation.
So from here we see creation before it was good, now it was very good, and we get in this last little bit here 3 times God did stuff. He created all the things. So that's kind of creation. That's kind of Genesis, the first chapter, and a little bit of the second chapter, which kicks off the Bible. And so, just to be fair to everyone, we're going to knock evolution soon as well. So just to kind of pick up some difficulties with Genesis, some potential difficulties here, and this is where the spectrum of perspectives comes from, is the meaning of this idea of day. So people could take this in mainly two different meanings. And one is the literal meaning, so a day is 24 hours, and therefore the creation week is 168 hours long. The other way to take it is a literal meaning, and so kind of poetic meaning, depending on how you read the genre of Genesis and each of the chapters of Genesis. Okay, so if you read it literally, creation happened in 168 hours. If you read it literarily, creation could have happened over a longer period of time. Okay, so that's just a difficulty, I guess, that there is with creation. With Genesis, there are also these things called anachronisms. So chronism, or chronos, is time, and ana means against. Okay? So anachronism just means something that doesn't flow with time, or is a bit weird in terms of the timing. And so we see, reading Genesis just then, for example, that on the early days we had the light, evening and morning existing, but then only on the fourth day were the sun and the moon created. And so possible anachronism, a possible difficulty here is, how did light, morning and evening exist before those heavenly bodies? Another anachronism that we want to pick out here is perhaps Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2. So we didn't read the whole Genesis 2, but if you read it would say, or you would kind of see written in Genesis 2 that man was created, then animals, and then woman. But in Genesis 1 we saw there were animals and then there were humans. Okay, so again, some potential difficulties with some readings of Genesis, just acknowledging the difficulties that And we can hit some of these in question time. Okay, but if we kind of take a helicopter view now of Genesis and think about high-level conclusions we can draw from it, there are three main high-level conclusions, I think. The first one is that God was there, and he existed, he created. Okay? And for him to be able to create stuff, he has to be outside the stuff. Okay? So he's outside nature. The second high-level conclusion we want to draw here is that there is an order and logic, okay, to nature, to creation. And first were some things, then came other things, then came other things. And there was quite a nice order to it. And the third one I want to pick up on is that humans were created in God's image. We're kind of unique, okay, and we also have this special role to play as part of nature. So those three high-level conclusions we'll take forward to the rest of the talk. Alright, so that's kind of Genesis. A very, very quick overview of Genesis. Now let's think about evolution. Okay. So, evolution, Pokemon has done a great disservice to the teaching of evolution, because now you've got a generation of children who think if you throw candy at an animal, it will evolve. And so that's not evolution, this is evolution. And so evolution obviously was born from Darwin's natural selection idea. And so we won't read this, but I want to pick out some highlighted points in here. And the idea here is that Darwin drew this very famous thing, thinking, I think, with this tree of life, essentially, and we'll see a bigger tree of life soon. But the idea here is that everything kind of evolved, or came about from one common ancestor. And so Darwin writes, this is an extract from his Origin of Species text. He writes, there is the idea that there are many more individuals of each species than the environment can support, and therefore they struggle for existence, they struggle for survival. Okay? And if there are variations in these individuals, in the environment, okay, that means this struggle, some will struggle better and some will struggle worse. And because of these variations in conditions for life, some will survive and some won't. Okay, and this is the idea of natural selection. And then you have the idea of inheritance, in that the ones who survive will be able to pass on the characteristics that enable them to survive to their offspring. Okay, and this will then propagate into their offspring. And this, I guess, can be summed up in this divergence of character idea. Okay, so that's kind of from Darwin's mouth, just like we heard from Genesis, we're hearing from Darwin's mouth. And so I just want to give a really quick, the biologist in me, the lecturer in me, wants to kind of teach evolution in 5 minutes, so I will. So just to recap the ideas of evolution, since we're giving equal opportunities to both, inheritance is a central feature of evolution. So this is a bear. The bear has DNA. The bear has cells, and so the cells has DNA. Okay? And the DNA is this bunch of letters, this bunch of information, it's G's, C's, A's, and T's. Okay? The people who are doing MBLG, who have done MBLG, will know this excruciatingly well. So the idea here is that there's a bunch of G's, C's, A's, and T's inside the DNA of an organism. And then you may have a different organism, same bear, maybe this is a female bear now, and slightly different sequence of DNA. Okay? So this is natural variation that exists. And now, in order for inheritance to happen, there has to be reproduction, okay? And reproduction happens there. We're all adults here, so we understand there's sperm and there's egg. And in the process of actually forming these gametes, these sex cells, half of the genetic material, if you're talking about these kind of organisms, half of the material goes into, or from the male goes into the sperm, and half goes into the egg, and then fertilization takes place, and then, there's one cell, the zygote, that grows and grows and grows and grows until you have a fully formed baby bear. Okay? So that's inheritance. And you see that the baby bear now has a kind of mix of DNA, mix of information from both parents. Okay, so now let's think about something else. So that's inheritance. Let's think about diversity. Diversity of the genetic information there. We see kind of fairly basic diversity here, not too much diversity, but for differences to exist, each one of us, we don't look the same, and so there are differences in our DNA which cause that difference. And so there's genetic diversity that exists, and the diversity comes about through things like mutation, through things like recombination, we won't go into those, but differences in the information do exist inside one single species, inside all of us. Now, this means that when you have diversity and then you mix up this diversity when you do inheritance, you're going to get a bunch of different types of offspring. Okay, And these different types of offspring could be fuzzier, fatter, more runnier, more angry looking, things like this. Okay? So this introduces diversity into the population, and this is what natural selection then acts upon. So the next thing we need to talk about after diversity is this thing called natural selection. So these bears, okay, so there's a fuzzy bear up the top left, there's a normal bear here, there's a running bear here, and there's kind of a fat bear there. Okay? So let's introduce some kind of permutation or perturbation into their environment. So let's say there's an ice age or something. The fat bear is quite, quite well suited to this, and so is the kind of fuzzy bear because it's got lots of fur, and so these two others die out and they can't reproduce. And so, when they reproduce, they produce organisms which are similar to them. They have their mix of genetic material. Okay? And then we think about the next generation. Next generation happens, they breed, they get selected, they breed, they get selected, they breed, they get selected. Okay? Over time, what you may get, if the ice age continues, for example, you may get really lots of fat bears because they can, they can hold much better. But as these differences in the genetic information accumulate over many, 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 many generations, what you may get is a very different kind of bear, maybe a standing bear, or maybe a different type of hunting bear. So the idea here is that as you have differences in the information, you have inheritance of this, and also you have strong selective pressures. Over time, and this is many, many generations, many, many years, over time you may have the organisms looking different enough or behaving differently enough or having different enough DNA such that they are no longer the same species. Okay? And they can't interbreed and they can't produce viable offspring. Okay, so the idea of evolution that often gets pushed around is this kind of thing that a monkey turns into something else, it turns into something into a human. So that's not a good way to see it. Rather, like we saw before with the bears, a monkey, a monkey can reproduce with other monkeys and produce monkeys and going towards kind of now, those monkeys could still exist. But then somewhere along this, maybe there was a speciation event where enough differences accumulated that a different type of primate appeared. And maybe this primate reproduce, okay, and then maybe it went extinct at one point. And then, but before that, maybe it evolved, it developed into a different type of species. And again, and again, and again, until we get humans. Okay, so this is the whole idea of evolution of humans. And going back to the monkey, you see we can draw a very, very long line, which looks a bit like this. Okay? And so this is the amazing tree of life. As a biologist, I love this. It just amazes me how diverse life is. And so starting from this little dot here is called Luca, the last universal common ancestor. But it's a single cell. Okay? A single cell called Luca, who essentially, gave rise through this evolutionary process to the whole of known species that have ever lived. Okay? And if we then want to zoom in on this kind of right-hand side, because we're all very self-centered, we see humans here as this tiny little branch on this amazing big tree of evolutionary life. Okay, so that's kind of evolution in a nutshell. That's kind of what you learn in half a semester of first year. But there are some difficulties with evolution. Okay? Acknowledging difficulties in both genesis and evolution. The difficulties in evolution include probability. Okay? The infinitesimally small probability of some of these speciation events happening. Okay? Related to this is the idea of the origin of life. Evolution talks about how life, one cell, how Luca could become lots of different things, but it doesn't explain how Luca, the last universal common ancestor cell, doesn't explain how that came about. How did inorganic substances produce organic substances to produce the first cell? That's still a very big jump that evolution can't quite answer, or science can't quite answer that. And just last month, there was this paper out in Nature, and if you know journals and stuff, Nature is like, ooh, Nature. And they were going on about arguments about how this Luca existed and came about. And so these guys are saying, Luca came about from hydrothermal vents as opposed to from a primordial soup and UV rays. So there's lots of still archaeology and science around how this origin of life came about. There's also interesting issues around microevolution versus macroevolution. Okay? So macroevolution is, you could simplistically consider it to be speciation, so the generation of different species. Okay? Microevolution is the adaptation of one species to suit its environment or its habitat. Okay? And one of the difficulties here is that with microevolution, Darwin observed what he thinks is evolution. Okay? Normally, the way that you would define it is Darwin observed lots of different fish, bird species on the islands. Okay? And for them to be able to be classified as different species, there are different ways to classify, but one of the ways is the biological species concept. Okay? And that means that two organisms of different species, if they cannot interbreed, very simplistically, the different species that cannot interbreed. And so Darwin observed 17 species. But recent DNA evidence has shown that actually those features did interbreed successfully. Right? And so this kind of pulls into question, well, what was Darwin observing? Were these species actually different species, or were these just variations of one species? Okay? Did speciation, did macroevolution actually occur? Okay? And so this particular paper is quite interesting. It talks about this extensive evidence of interspecific gene flow. Okay, so those are some difficulties with evolution. But we can, even without those difficulties again, if we take a helicopter view, we can draw some high-level conclusions. Okay, so 3 again. Information is in DNA. And this information is passed on from generation to generation. That's a necessity. DNA is changeable, it's mutable. Okay? And natural selection acts on these changes, these variations inside DNA. And finally, with evolution, the final high-level conclusion is that all living organisms share that LUCA, that last universal common ancestor. Okay, so coming back to our little diagram of the underlying issue, Genesis versus evolution. I'm going to kind of address this idea here of this fight between Genesis and evolution. Now we've kind of had a lesson on both. And one way that people often think about Genesis and evolution is a pie. So they think, science is kind of here, and the Bible is here. And so back in the 1700s or before, people didn't know too much about how stuff worked, about science. And so they said, well, science explains some things that we know about, but the Bible explains everything else. Okay? People often call this the God of the Gaps argument. Now, the God of the Gaps argument is problematic because it means that as scientific thought and understanding increases, you're squeezing God into a smaller and smaller gap. And then if science gets to a point where it can explain a lot of things, and essentially, and this is where Dawkins comes from, you don't need God anymore. Okay? Obviously the argument is, just because you don't need something doesn't mean it's not there. Just because you don't need your parents looking after you doesn't mean it's not there. And so this is kind of not a great way to think of the kind of the verses between science and evolution, science and Genesis. A nicer way, we switch pastries and we go to a cake instead. So not a pie, but rather a layer cake. And so this particular cake here says that science tells us the what and tells us the how quite well. So that evolutionary tree tells us, all those amazing things, all the whats that have been, have existed and exist, and also evolution tries to explain to us the how. And then the Bible here talks to us about the why and the who. Okay, so who created? It was God who created. And why did he create? He created because we were here, or he put us in here, and then creation is kind of for us. And so this is an interesting idea for me. So I actually started off as a non-Christian. I was a non-Christian for most of my life, actually. And I was very science-y. Okay? I planted potatoes in the backyard, and I dug them up and said, wow, more potatoes. And so being Asian, and going to OC and that kind of stuff, I did fairly well academically. And so I thought, I know the answer, I don't need something else to tell me the answer and stuff. And so I remember one stage telling my sister, my sister had a phase where she believed she was religious, and I said, well, your God is everywhere. If I punch the air down, I'm punching your God. Am I hurting him? Can I hurt him? And so I had this very kind of young, egotistic view of everything. And then so I thought to myself, these Christians are a bit crazy, and so what I might do is I might read the Bible so I can get some ammunition against them. But then when I read the Bible, I read about this person called Jesus, okay, God and Jesus. And Jesus was this guy who existed, but he existed in the world, but he created the world. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. Okay. But Jesus went into the world, even though he's the creator of the world, he went into the world to die for me. A person who would punch the air thinking I'm punching God. Okay, so Jesus died for an idiot like me. I thought why would he do that? That makes absolutely no sense. It was a nonsensical thing, but at the same time, that nonsensical thing made perfect sense to me. Okay? That this amazing God would be out there to actually take something that I deserve, and that separation of death from him, and actually sent his son to take that away from me. This is an amazing, amazing thing. And so, for me, matching science and matching science to religion hasn't been too difficult. I quite like this quote. We have to, if you're at a talk about evolution, you have to mention Richard Dawkins. And this is a quote from him. More generally, one of the truly bad effects of religion, he thinks, is that it teaches us that it's a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding. And this is around that God of the gaps kind of thing. If we don't understand something, let's just say God did it. But as a Christian scientist, I'm not satisfied with that. I think God is great, He's there, but also science is great, and it explains stuff for us as well. Okay? And so we can actually say that, well, no, religion is not satisfied with understanding. We use science to satisfy that understanding there. And a nice example, so this is rice. Okay? This is a rice, what do we call this thingy on top of the rice thing? But I spent my second year taking photos, microscopic photos of the rice plant in this particular, it's called the tapetum, which is essentially the little layer of cells which feeds the pollen and helps the pollen develop. And these are totally unpublished images, so you can't take photos of this and share it out with the world. But this is a cross-section, it's kind of like a CT scan of that little rice developing thing, okay? And as we sliced through the CT scan, what we saw in the lab was this amazing complexity in the different types of cells and cell layers and even the organelles inside each of these cells. And then if we kind of zoom in onto this layer here, what we see is something like this. Okay? So there's, again, amazing complexity. And for me, as a Christian scientist, sitting in front of the microscope looking at this is only observable if you stain it in a particular way, at a particular time, and look at it in a particular way as well. 40 people in the world have seen this image, maybe, or less. You guys are the next 100 to see it. Okay? But, God saw this. God made this. It's amazing. Okay? And so for me, it's the idea of combining the amazingness of science and what it can explain to us about the natural world with God's creation as well. Okay, so going back to this view, the question is Jesus descended from apes. This is a passage again from the Bible, the New Testament this time from Philippians, and it talks about this Jesus guy. Okay? The talk is named after. And this Jesus guy was essentially equal with God, but then he didn't take that on board, but rather emptied himself, came down to earth, and died. Okay? And so we come back to our original question of, what is the impact of this? If Jesus, God, created through 168 hours of Genesis, okay, so 7 times 24 hours, this doesn't change what Jesus did on the cross. Okay? He still died for you and I, he still died for sins, and he still is our sacrifice. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, if God indeed create through evolution, and again, Genesis is not entirely clear, again, depending on which reading of it you take, if God did create through evolution, it still doesn't change what Jesus did. Okay? Jesus still died for us, he still died the sacrifice that we deserved. And so, this kind of evolutionary mindset is quite interesting for me personally, because I think, well, if this is a guy who created the world, and then he came into that evolutionary tree to be a human, and fully God, doesn't that make it even more amazing of what he did? And he essentially went into the whole lineage, from Luca, all the way through to bananas, all the way through to monkeys, through to humans, and he's part of his creation. For God, a creator, to come down and stoop so low to be part of his creation, that's an amazing thing. And to me, that actually speaks more highly of Jesus' sacrifice. Okay, so I guess for us the idea here maybe isn't so much, is it science versus the Bible, but rather they're complementary. Okay? The Bible tells us some things, and science tells us other things. They're quite good, both at explaining the things that they're good at explaining. The Bible doesn't tell us about starfish, it doesn't tell us about Harley-Davidsons, it doesn't tell us about those things, and it shouldn't need to. And science can't tell us about God. Science can't disprove God. And it can't prove God or disprove God, because they belong in different planes of existence, but they do both support each other. So hopefully I'll stop talking now. But that's kind of my perspective of how this works. And again, like Andrew said, this is not key business. Okay, so we've got time for a panel discussion now, I think. So hopefully you're sending through your questions. I think we put your time to sleep.
So my name's Annabelle. I'm doing a Bachelor of Science majoring in Advanced Biology, and I am what's considered an old Earth creationist. So I believe that there's lots of evidence that our Earth is really old and our universe is really old. But I have problems with understanding macroevolution. There's been no documented cases of speciation that we have observed, and the very low probabilities that there are. And I believe in the Bible that there's so many times which affirms that God is a creative God. And the reading of Genesis, I think you can take the reading of days to be a bit more lenient. We don't know. Throughout the Bible, days can be a literal day or it can be 1,000 years. It's a lot of variation in that.
Cool. I'm Chris. I'm a third-year science student majoring in advanced environmental studies and plant science. And I am, I suppose what you call a theistic evolutionist, in that I believe in evolution. But I believe that God created the world and then created the process of evolution. And then through that, he had through that guiding the process of evolution into a design that he intended evolution to end up at.
My name is Atherwork. You call me Afro, if that makes it easier. I am a young Earth creationist. That explains a bit about what young Earth creation is. It's the view that the Earth is around 6,000 years old. I am a young Earth creationist primarily because I believe the Bible is God's word, and my presuppositional foundation is that the Bible is God's word, and if it's God's word, it's the truth because God cannot lie. If that's the case, I argue the case that the Bible teaches that the Earth is a young Earth, and that it doesn't have appearance of age, but primarily it's young Earth. As to the reasons why I believe the Bible is God's word, you can catch me after, we can have one discussion. And yeah, there are a number of reasons, but I'm safe on this.
First question that was sent in, is intelligent design a politically correct or diplomatic compromise between creationism and evolution? If not, can they coexist? Open to the panel.
So I think intelligent design, calling intelligent design politically correct is funny because it's quite politically angsty, especially in the US. I think, so intelligent design talks about how there is structure and order in nature, and how that is kind of suggesting that there is a designer out there. The thing with ID is that it doesn't talk about God. It just says there's a designer. It doesn't talk about a Christian God or anything like that. It just says that because there is order, there must be a designer. And it almost speaks of God with the gaps. Yeah, so I don't think it's particularly a kind of a politically correct average between creationism and evolution. It's something separate, I think. It's probably not a non-answer, almost.
So if you do, I think it's what is this thing called science, second year subject, definitely go into this sort of stuff in the history and philosophy of science. And the whole idea around ID was, fights in America about whether creation should be taught in schools as a part of science, as an alternative to evolution. And after, in a court battle, creationism was deemed to not be part of science. Someone then came up with the idea of, well, intelligent design should be instead. And then there was another court battle, and then that was shown not to be. So that's how the political idea definitely does have a lot of social stuff to it. It's not really as much of, as Danny showed, it's not really one of the different, it doesn't really lie on the spectrum, because as he said, it's not descriptive of who's designing it, where it comes in, or anything like that. It is kind of political term.
Cool. Next question. What's your thoughts on fossils of early human species and closely related apes?
Yeah, so yes, I think the fossil record doesn't actually present very well the transitional species. I think if we were to believe in macroevolution and evolution over time, we would expect to see a lot more transitional forms in the evolutionary record, and there's a lack thereof of that. There are obviously transitional forms, some transitional forms that we see, but the number of which, and also I think the number of which is not great. more than that, some of them are very dubious, and I wouldn't put that as great evidence of science. I wouldn't put that as great evidence which would overcome my understanding of the Bible or my interpretation of the Bible, which I believe is.
Cool. Next question. How do you deal with the Bible being an absolute source of truth? Does this mean you cannot challenge or try and test any of the ideas within it?
How do I believe? Well, I think there are a number of reasons why I believe the Bible is absolutely authoritative. I think God himself gives us those reasons in the Bible. If you read Isaiah 45 verses 9 to 10, actually 6 to 9 to 10, it says, I am God and there is no other, declaring the end from the beginning, from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose. And this is a passage, God is almost boasting here, because it's saying, I am the God, and there's none other, and I declare the end from the beginning. If you read through the Bible, especially passages like Isaiah 53, which declare very clearly the life of Christ and what he's going to do. Isaiah says, which is a book written 700 years before Christ, says stuff like, he will be hated by all men, he will die for there's a man who's going to come, he's going to die for the sins of men, and he will take away all of our sins. And there are multiple other prophecies in the Old Testament which confirm the New Testament, and I can't look at that as evidence and say, oh, this Bible is false. Obviously, there is some higher power who's directed this Bible, and no one else can look into the future and tell it. And so, from that, and from many other reasons, I come to accept that the Bible is completely God's word, and that it is absolute truth. It is without error. It doesn't mean interpretation is without error, but the Bible itself is without error.
Because it definitely seems to be, towards that work. But none of the rest of us here are saying that the Bible isn't true. So whether you're like me, or even with Danny and Chris who take the theistic evolution idea, it's to do with the interpretation of the Bible. So we do believe that the Bible is true. It says so many times that God is creator. It's more interpretation of how you read Genesis, because there's many different readings. It's very poetic, so some people say it's more poetry, and then some people say no, it is actually a literal historic account. And I think that's, we all believe that the Bible is true. It's the interpretation, and particularly as none of us were actually there back then, we humans aren't really the best source for what happened back in the beginning of time.
Sorry. We believe the Bible.
Next question. Along the evolutionary timescale, could Adam and Eve be considered as the first individuals of the Homo sapiens species?
By my understanding, Adam and Eve definitely did exist. Whether they were necessarily the first humans ever, I'm not entirely sold on that myself. I haven't done enough research into it. One of the things on that is when Cain, one of Adam and Eve's sons, is kind of kicked out after killing his brother, he then goes and builds a city. Why would he need a city if there were only 4 people? I'm a bit confused in my own mind, whether Adam and Eve were the first of God's people or whether the first of Homo sapiens in general. But I may be unique in my views.
Yeah, so I think biologically speaking, there is no biological issue with having a first Adam and a first Eve, or first female and male Homo sapien. So I don't think there's an issue in terms of that. And yeah, there are some interpretations where it's like Chris was saying before, there's a few strange things happening, like building a city for 4 people or something, which don't quite add up. And some people think that Adam and Eve are kind of figurative, and so it kind of talks about, and when Adam and Eve sin and turns against God, it's kind of humanity sinning and turning against God, as opposed to two human beings initially. But it's about interpretation.
Cool. Next, so somebody asked if each of the panelists could go along and describe their interpretation of the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2 and how it aligns with their views, which could be interesting. So
This could take a while.
just very quickly, of how they understand Genesis.
But I take Genesis to be literally, meaning when God says He made the earth in 6 days, I understand it to be 6 literal days, as opposed to limited views of periods of time. There are various reasons why I do that. I think it has implications on other parts of the Bible, how we read the rest of the Bible. For instance, Romans, I think the rest of the Bible also refers to Genesis as literal events. Romans 5:19, which says, which talks about him as a literal person, and other passages like 1 Corinthians 15 as well, which talk about him as a literal person. Jesus refers to Noah as a real person, who says, as in the days of the watch, shall be in the days of the coming Son of Man. It seems to me that the Bible refers to Genesis in a literal manner, and that's why I will take a literal interpretation of Genesis. Yeah, that's my
Cool. My interpretation is that Genesis doesn't show us the science or the mechanisms behind the world, but it really more shows us the relationship of God to our world and the science and the mechanisms behind it. It shows that God has the authority to create, the authority to rule, and it shows his relationship and his love for all creation and for all in that.
So I interpret Genesis as being almost like a semi-literal. Days could be interpreted in different forms, so whether it was a literal day or whether it was different time periods, I don't think we can determine that, but I do believe that God made humans and plants himself, and what time frame that was, but that the Earth, the solar systems, the galaxy and all of that was there before. It wasn't just completely void with absolutely nothing.
So I'm along the same lines as Chris. I'm a theistic evolutionist, and so what that says is that the whole tree of life thing I'm good with, including the human bit as well. So I'm okay with humans descending from apes, and therefore Jesus being a human who also descended from apes. So to that answer, I'd say yes. And in terms of how to read Genesis, I would say it is the billions of years that science says, or science suggests. So.
There's been a few questions come in about how we can reconcile death and sin entering the world with evolution. So does somebody want to take that away?
We practice for this. So we really did. So death and sin. So if we follow the evolutionary tree, okay, there were mass extinctions, okay, and for natural selection to occur, there has to be death. There must be death. And so the question, I guess, fundamentally is, how can we say that evolution is true? Because evolution says there's death, and the Bible says that sin, when sin entered the world, when Adam and Eve turned against God, that's when death entered the world. That's the fundamental question, I think. So my perspective of that is that the death that entered is spiritual death, and when God said, you know, if you eat of that tree, you will die. Well, they didn't die; they were separated from God, and they eventually died because they were removed from, and again, in reading of this, removed from access to the tree of life, and so they couldn't keep eating of that and get forever. And so I think the idea of mixing death and evolution and the Genesis account is okay in my mind. If we take that kind of literary idea of death being separation from God.
Talking about the tree of life is a story.
Yeah.
After the snake bit cut off and then the Eve bit, that's the tree of life.
We're in agreement.
So time is almost up. Is there a question from the floor that anybody would like to ask? Yeah?
I was just wondering where you see the concept of treating equilibrium.
Maybe explain what.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know what untreated equilibrium is, it's in, there's, I guess, two forms of evolution. So there's the Darwinian evolution, so that's gradual evolution over time. But during the 70s, Stephen J. perpetuated equilibrium because the fossil record doesn't show all the transitional species, and you have the explosion of Cambrian explosion, so you have all these species in the fossil record, and someone's like, how'd that all come there? So the idea was that evolution occurred in short bursts where you have lots of species to talk about. Yeah, question?
I'm perfectly okay with the notion that I don't fully understand how everything got there. That's for God to know, with me to find out as I study science, which is why I really enjoy studying science. I'm just able to explore and marvel at God's wondrous creation, whether or not everything was fully gradual, whether there was periods of stimulated change. We haven't discovered that yet.